So we are in the beautiful town of WalthamAbbey in Essex to look at a building which is now a pub. It's historically a pub as well, but that's not allegedly how it began its life. Now, thankfully, the wonderful lady which runs the pub actually provided me with a bit of information. Some stories might allude to the fact that this property and this property were built at the same time as the original abbey which sits behind you, Waltham Abbey, which is what the town is actually named after. But thankfully I have this wonderful picture frame here to read from to explain one of the theories as to why it's actually called the Welsh Harp. There are several theories, but this is one of them. So I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. Although this building dates back to at least the 15th century, bear in mind there are other tales that might suggest it is older, so we always have to take this with a pinch of salt. The earliest record of it being used as a public house is from the 17th century, though then it was called the Harp. Now there's a couple of reasons why it might have been changed to the Welsh Harp. We'll get to that shortly. In the 1960s, a receipt in the name of the Harp and dated 1680 was found during building work. Now this doesn't mean that that's when it began its life. For all we know, it could have only been recorded, or a record of it being found at this time, so it could have already been in operation for quite a long time. There is another reference to the harp in the rolls of the manor for 1740. In 1863, the public house was still called the Harp, in brackets, in White's History, Gazetteer and Directory of the County of Essex, though the address is given as Church Street, interesting, rather than Market Square, because just the other side through these gates, which I'll talk about momentarily, there's a market that still continues to this day, which has gone on for centuries, which is also another one of the allegations as to why it was called the Welsh Harp. We'll get to that shortly. Though the address is given as Church Street rather than Market Square, there is no doubt that the site of the pub was the same then as it is today. Well, they say no doubt, I'll take their word for it. In a reference from Miller Christie, written in 1887, we learn that the Welsh Harp at Waltham Abbey, probably taken from the arms of Principality of Wales, is presumably the modern form of the harp which existed there in 1789 and long after. Therefore, from the above two references, we know that the name was changed sometime between 1863 and 1887, possibly to commemorate the 21st birthday of the Prince of Wales in November 1862. Essex trade directories of the time tell us that William Skinner was licensed of the harp in 1863 and the Welsh Harp in 1980. Now, as you can see here, it claims that it may have been called the Welsh Harp due to the Prince of Wales. However, there are other rumours that the Welsh community would bring their cattle, and it's not rumours, it's true, the Welsh community would bring their cattle to towns such as Waltham Abbey, and they would graze off of the luscious pastures nearby to fatten them up, to prepare them for the market. So that is just as likely to be why this is called the Welsh Harp as the Prince of Wales. Ultimately, we don't have a definitive reason, but the multiple reasons would certainly give us an illusion as to how many people must have gossiped or wondered as to why it's actually called the Welsh Harp. Now, something particularly fascinating to me is when I was speaking to the absolutely lovely lady that runs the pub that was very helpful, she told me that there's a huge chance the property was first created on behalf of the monks that would be within the abbey directly behind you. And then she went on to say something very sentimental and important, which is that the chances are the most important relic within this site is actually these gates. And I loved that, and I asked why. And she said it was because this is where the funeral procession would pass through. And the more wealthy you were, the more opulent your procession would be. You may be covered in silk. So this was a very symbolic place. Most likely, whether this was a pub or not, it still would have been a very symbolic place. So whether you was drinking in here or drinking elsewhere, you knew that you would eventually be coming to this spot, which would have been a very touching event for the time, because death was a huge reality of history, as it is today, but today it's sort of masked over, whereas in the past death was an everyday occurrence. And we can only imagine how spooky it would be to be able to watch a funeral procession walking through here within the last few centuries. And it's wonderful as well that the lady that runs this pub cares enough to know these things, and it's not just relying on us. We can sometimes walk into a pub and we'll find someone that genuinely cares enough, not just about public houses, but the intrinsic details that make them so very special. So now you'll see why I'm particularly perplexed as to what is the truth behind the naming of the Welsh Harp, because there's a third reason that it may have been named the Welsh Harp. The WalthamAbbey gunpowder mills are not far from here. And like Enfield Island Village, which also isn't far from here, they served much of the empire. Now, one of the allegations is that there was a Welsh military or Welsh battalion division nearby. So now we've got so many possibilities as to why this might be called the Welsh Harp. I'm running out of ideas which is most likely. But when we're dealing with a pub with so many centuries behind it, all I can do is mention the allegations, especially when we have such little evidence of which one is true. Another allegation, which I'm full of today, WalthamAbbey had the most pubs per head of capita than anywhere else. Once again, because those pubs are all long gone, I can't prove that or claim it to be true, but it would be wrong of me not to mention it. Just before I close up on this particular point, I will say, obviously, we're stood in front of the official WalthamAbbey that you can see has been changed throughout multiple centuries, down to Catholicism, Protestantism, and so on. I love seeing the stones, the differences, the changing in the epoch to epoch, and it's very political as well as religious. One thing I will say, I don't want to get too deep into it because you could talk about this church and the history forever. Whenever you're dealing with any property with centuries of history, you could become lost at any time. I will say though, there was a chapel for Henry VII in there, who was the first of the Tudor line, and it was his son who would later dissolve the monasteries and dissolve this property. So I wonder if Henry VII ever thought it would be his own son that would come along and sort of undermine his chapel. Henry VII would have been Catholic, praying in Latin, and it was his son who actually began the idea of Protestantism as we know it. Now, we don't want to stray too far from the pub subject, but it's hard not to do that with the amount of history that circles the pubs in question. Now, in 1066, King Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings. 1066 might be a familiar year for people because this is when William the Conqueror took over. This is obviously where we would get the White Tower and the Tower of London, so on, Rochester Cathedral, via Bishop Gundulf and so on, who was a Norman architect. And this is actually the grave of King Harold. This marks the end of that lineage and the changeover to the French, the Norman line as we know it. So the pub, as I said, if I was to get into the true history of the Abbey and the surroundings, I would be here forever. But let me remind you that King Harold, like many people, are sat facing the Welsh Harp. At first glance, first thing you'll notice is the shape of the pub. Now, to use politically correct and official English language, as you can see, it's more pissed than the most pissed of punters, but it's still stunning. And that's what makes it stunning, is it looks a bit oblong, it looks a bit out of shape, looks like a bad Tetris player dropped his Game Boy, but nonetheless it's beautiful, and that's what makes it so special to the eye and the heart. And we've been provided with this lovely image by the landlady. I don't know if it's going to blur. Can you pick, is that coming out okay? Give us a nod, yeah? Is that coming out? And you can see it says here, ironically, Dan's birth year, 1976, ladies and gents, a very special year. Okay? So don't forget that. Can't remember what date it is. If any of you want to start giving Dan special gifts, that's up to you. And I must mention as well that we are drinking our pints on the house. Now, not only are we drinking our pints on the house, but Janice Whitehead from Bethnal Green, who works behind the bar, pours one of the best pints that we've come across recently. We said it, as soon as she finished pouring the pints, we said, "Who poured these?" She said, "That was me." And then she said, no, I worked in Bethnal Green, from Bethnal Green, and it all made sense. Once I knew she was from the East, it made sense why she can pour such a fantastic pint. Now, I think we better go inside and appreciate it. Just before we do, as usual, I can't help but mention how much I love the lanterns. Everyone knows I'm a lantern fanatic, you know. If I was a wealthy man with a massive property, I'd have loads of them. But before we do take off, once again, nice bit of effort with the hanging baskets. But I think with a building like this, even if you put no outside touches on, the building does all the work for you. So just before we end, have a pan down. Look at this lovely, charming, tiny window here. And it's stepping back, not just into what we see as Tudor architecture, but architecture of our ancestors altogether. Now, I'll try and be somewhat quiet so as not to disturb people in here. But when Dan and I first started looking into this pub, we thought we was approaching a closed pub. It was closed at the time, and this was heartbreaking. You know, I've passed this pub many times. I actually love this area. I love the River Lee, just down the road there. And I know the areas which are nearby. So when he told me it was closed, that did gut me a little bit. So we're very lucky to be sitting inside, because as the time approached for us to come and film, Dan rang me up and said, "Finn, it's open." So this is not just lucky for us, it's lucky for anyone that loves pubs and history altogether, and British culture. Now, another thing I will say to conclude is I hope that if you are from the younger generations, that either watching this series or listening to some of the talking points will help you connect with some of the properties which might seem a bit fuddy-duddy to you. But as I've said many times, my grandfather wore trousers and a shirt and tie in his living room, and his grandfather did the same. His grandfather might have worn trousers to go into a coal mine. So ultimately, the fallacy of modern design is very new, the way that we all wear tracksuits and so on. So hopefully, if you are from a younger generation, over time you will start to consciously or subconsciously care for the things that are worth preserving. I can't force you to do so. If I could, I would. But all I can do is ask you to start caring about the things that aren't replaceable. Anyone can put up a load of plastic and cement and glass, but it takes a lot more effort and care to preserve something. Remember that and think for yourself. I'll see you soon.